Jim and I had just completed our day shift at the plant, and we were heading home together in my car. Whenever our work schedules aligned, we shared the commute, and this week it was my turn to drive. As we left the plant, Jim asked if we could make a quick stop at a pharmacy on our way home to pick up a prescription for his wife, Sally, who was battling a severe cold. I realized that we'd be passing by the pharmacy where my wife, Rachel, was employed, and I decided to make it a surprise visit for both Jim and Rachel. In all the years she had worked there, I'd never dropped by her workplace, so I knew it would be an unexpected treat for her. I had refrained from visiting her at the pharmacy because I didn't want her co-workers or her boss to think I was checking up on her. Interestingly, she had never brought up the topic either. She was on duty that day, and I was sure she'd be genuinely surprised to see me, since she only worked there twice a week. It felt like the right time to finally meet her boss after 6 years of marriage. Rachel and I had been married for 9 years, and while we weren't wealthy, I had a steady income from the plant, which allowed her to stay at home. However, 2 years into our marriage, she expressed a desire to rejoin the workforce, feeling the need to get out of the house and explore job opportunities. Rachel had expressed her desire to have her own car, and after some convincing, I agreed to let her work for a year or two to save up for it. About a week after we came to this agreement, she found a job at a pharmacy across town. Just a little over a year later, she gave birth to Sandy, and for the following 2 years, she chose to be a stay-at-home mom. However, as Sandy grew older, Rachel once again urged me to allow her to work, even if it was only a couple of days a week. She had already spoken to her former employer, Mr. Clarkson, at the pharmacy, and he was willing to take her back part-time. After some consideration, I agreed, and she arranged with her mother to look after Sandy on the days she would be working. Rachel had been working at Mr. Clarkson's pharmacy for over 3 years now, 2 days a week, and Sandy was almost 6 years old. Surprisingly, I had never visited her workplace during all that time. When Jim and I arrived at the pharmacy, we entered together. While not a large store, it had all the typical pharmacy items one might expect, with 4 long aisles stocked with products ranging from cough syrup to various brands. Towards the back was the area where prescriptions were filled. We naturally headed in that direction. However, to my surprise, Rachel was not there as I had anticipated. Instead, a middle-aged man was behind the counter, taking care of Jim's prescription. I had planned to introduce myself and inquire about Rachel's whereabouts, but with Jim beside me, I didn't want to reveal my ignorance about her absence. So, I remained silent. As the pharmacist worked on Jim's prescription, Jim began to explore the different displays around the pharmacy. That's when I made up my mind to explore the back of the pharmacy. As I peered over the counter behind the pharmacist, my gaze landed on a desk situated near the wall. On that desk, there was a framed photograph of a girl who appeared to be about 7 or 8 years old. What truly struck me about the picture was the remarkable resemblance the child bore to my own daughter, Sandy. The long blonde hair, the blue eyes, even the smile, they all matched. I stood there in astonishment, scrutinizing the photo. I was utterly shocked and taken aback by the uncanny likeness between this child and my daughter. It felt like I was glimpsing into Sandy's future, maybe a year or so down the line. I couldn't help but wonder how such a resemblance was possible. Suddenly, I found myself unable to restrain my curiosity, and I asked the pharmacist, who was still occupied with pill counting, if the girl in the picture was his daughter. He responded, "No, I have only 2 boys at home. This is Kathy. She's Mr. Clarkson's daughter. She's a delightful child, isn't she?" I replied, "Yes, she certainly is," though I was too shocked to say much more. I moved away, pretending to browse an item on one of the shelves to my left. Deep inside, a sense of unease began to gnaw at me. I couldn't stop wondering how Kathy could resemble my daughter so closely. And where was my wife in all of this? Although I had a faint inkling of the answers to these questions, I wasn't ready to admit it to myself just yet. Suddenly, a strong urge to leave the pharmacy washed over me. I walked over to Jim and explained that I would be waiting for him in the car. While I sat in the car waiting for Jim, my thoughts began to wander. Sandy bore no resemblance to Rachel, and she didn't share any of my facial features either. Rachel and I both had brown eyes and dark brown hair, whereas Sandy had blonde hair. When she was a young child, my friends often made jokes about her hair color, Some even playfully asked if I had pizza deliveries frequently or joked about the mailman's hair color. These were all lighthearted jests, and I never let them bother me. But now, those comments returned to haunt me. I started to wonder if Sandy was truly my daughter, or if she could be Mr. Clarkson's child. The odd thing was that I had never met or seen Carl Clarkson before, so I had no idea what he looked like, except for the fact that he had light-colored hair, which Rachel had mentioned a few times. Later that evening, when Rachel and I were at home, she noticed my quiet and contemplative mood. She even asked if something was bothering me. Of course, I didn't tell her about my visit to her workplace or the thoughts running through my mind. I desperately wanted to know where she had been when I stopped by, but I kept my doubts to myself. I realized that I needed to be cautious and not accuse her of something that might exist only in my imagination. More importantly, I understood the need for concrete evidence to confirm or dispel my doubts about our daughter's parentage. The mere thought that my precious angel might not be my biological child was excruciatingly painful. I cherished my daughter more than anyone else in the world and would do anything for her. I tried to convince myself that the similarities between the two girls were probably just a coincidence, but deep down, suspicion continued to gnaw at me. Later that night, while lying in bed next to my wife, the weight of the day's events finally hit me. If Sandy wasn't my daughter, and if Carl Clarkson was her biological father, it meant that Rachel had been deceiving him from the very beginning when she first started working for him over 6 years ago. I couldn't help but think that even today, she might still be carrying on her affair with him, fooling me all these years. Every time she returned home after being with her boss, she probably took secret pleasure in knowing she had successfully deceived me, all while I remained oblivious to her infidelity. I had already noticed her habit of rushing into the shower as soon as she came home, claiming she needed to remove the smell of the chemicals she worked with. Now I realized that she was using the showers to eliminate any traces of her recent unfaithfulness. The following day, which was a Friday, Rachel wasn't scheduled to work. After dropping Jim off at his house, I decided to visit her workplace with the intention of finally meeting Carl Clarkson face to face. Since he didn't know me and I had never seen him before, I felt it was time to get a glimpse of him. Upon asking the woman at the cash register about Mr. Clarkson's whereabouts, I was informed that he had already left for home. However, she mentioned that Mr. Manning, his assistant, could assist me with my prescription. She pointed toward the back, and I realized she was indicating the same man who had filled Jim's prescription the previous day. I told her I would return on another day, as I had personal business with Mr. Clarkson. To my surprise, she dropped a bombshell, warning me not to visit on Tuesday or Thursday afternoons, because he was never in the pharmacy at those times. I left without saying another word, just nodding to indicate my understanding. Sitting in my car, I couldn't help but wonder what was truly going on here. Rachel had been hired to assist Mr. Clarkson on those 2 days, mainly counting pills and helping with prescription filling. At home, she always referred to him as Mr. Clarkson. Now I had just learned that on those 2 working days of the week, he took the afternoon off. It didn't add up in my mind. What was Rachel up to during those afternoons? After all, she was supposed to be assisting her boss. The previous afternoon, she was absent from work, even though she was scheduled to be there. Could she have been somewhere else with him? I had initially been against her returning to work after Sandy was born, but she insisted on it until I finally gave in. Now, I had a bitter feeling about her job, and that picture of the child on her boss's desk kept haunting my thoughts. Doubts about my wife's fidelity were growing in my mind. Was she having an affair with her boss, or was it just my imagination running wild? That weekend at home with Rachel was the most agonizing time of my life. Whenever I looked at her, I couldn't help but imagine her being intimate with her boss. I couldn't even picture his face since I had never met him in person. Deep down, I suspected that there was a good chance Sandy might be his daughter. Was he still involved with my wife behind my back? Could she even be carrying his second child? It felt like all these years she had been with him more often than with me. Every time I looked at her, my anger surged. I knew that from that point on, I would be constantly frustrated until I found concrete evidence. One Saturday morning, while she slept beside me, I quietly observed her. She was undeniably a beautiful woman, but the thought of her potential infidelity weighed on me. We hardly spoke until noon that day, and when the three of us sat at the table, I mostly directed my conversation toward my daughter. That night in bed, I woke her up for intimacy. There were no kisses or tender words, just a straightforward encounter. It was my way of seeking revenge for what she had shared with another man, something that should have only been mine. Rachel's unusual tolerance of my mistreatment spoke volumes to me. It hinted that she had secrets to hide and was attempting to appease me with physical intimacy to divert my suspicions. Without concrete evidence of her infidelity, I couldn't comprehend why I was acting this way, but I felt an overwhelming urge to hurt her. Her lack of resistance to my behavior likely stemmed from fear. But why should she, my wife, be afraid of me unless she had something to conceal? She simply desired to end my anger swiftly so we could return to our daily routines at home. I could sense her reluctance to engage in any confrontation with me, fearful of revealing that I might have uncovered her dark secret. She sought peace by submitting to me and enduring the humiliation I imposed. With each passing day, my conviction grew stronger that she was involved with her boss, and I became increasingly convinced that their affair had been ongoing for years. Throughout my life, I had always been a gentle and caring husband, considering myself a loving partner to my wife. Now, I was merely using her body to fulfill my own desires, with little regard for her feelings. I felt no guilt for my actions, as I no longer viewed her as my beloved spouse. It seemed like I was trying to retaliate against her by being selfish and forceful during our intimacy. As time passed, I observed growing apprehension and fear in her demeanor. One evening, while she quietly sat across from me at the kitchen table, I watched as she ate in silence. I could tell she suspected that I might be aware of her involvement with Carl, and now she seemed reluctant to broach the subject openly and have an honest conversation with me. I wondered why she was so fearful since I had never been a violent man. Could it be that she wasn't ready to end her marriage with me? Perhaps she wished to maintain the security of our marriage while indulging in the excitement, or maybe even love, of her affair with her boss. I resolved to gather evidence of her infidelity and decided to take a day off the following Tuesday to follow her to her workplace. I had a strong suspicion that she and her lover didn't engage in their affair at the pharmacy, so they must have rendezvoused elsewhere to deceive me. Therefore, I planned to ask Jim if I could borrow his truck for that day to discreetly tail her. On Tuesday morning, I dressed in my usual work attire and drove to Jim's house. I handed him the keys to my car and set off in his truck. Upon returning home, I parked the truck a few houses away from our residence, ensuring a clear view of my home. Approximately half an hour later, I observed Rachel getting into her car with Sandy. I quietly trailed her to our daughter's school, where Sandy disembarked. Rachel then headed straight to the pharmacy. I parked Jim's truck on the opposite side of the street and patiently waited while listening to the radio. I wasn't entirely sure what I expected to unfold, but I had a gut feeling that something would. From my vantage point, I had a view of her red Toyota and most of the parking spaces adjacent to the pharmacy. I was determined to remain there all day, if necessary. About half an hour after she entered the pharmacy, I witnessed a black SUV entering the parking lot. The driver parked in the space next to my wife's Toyota. A tall, well-dressed man, around 35 years old, emerged from the vehicle and entered the pharmacy using a key to a private door located near the parking lot. The moment I saw him step out of his car, I realized that he was the father of the little girl in the framed picture. It struck me suddenly. This man was likely Sandy's biological father, and he was my wife's lover. He was the one who had been deceiving me for the past 6 years. I had a strong desire to chase him down and confront him physically, followed by taking out my anger on my wife, but the time for expressing my rage in that way had passed long ago. I was at least 6 years too late. It might have been acceptable to do so after she had cheated on me for the first or second time. But now, after 6 years of ongoing infidelity at a rate of possibly 2 times each week, it was too late for that. No. Now was the time to end my marriage and ensure they both faced consequences for what they had done to me. Revenge was on my mind. I patiently waited in Jim's truck until noon. Suddenly, I saw the same door swing open and Rachel and her lover emerged from the building. They both had smiles on their faces, and to an outsider, they appeared like a happy couple. They got into his SUV and drove away. Following the black SUV was straightforward, as my wife's lover didn't seem to be in a hurry. 15 minutes later, they were on a country road leading to the lake. Another 10 minutes, and I observed them turning into the entrance of a cozy log cottage right on the lake's shore. I parked Jim's truck on the side of the road half a mile away and then walked back towards the log cottage. It was surrounded by a tall, well-trimmed cedar hedge, except for the side facing the lake, which gave me the privacy I needed to avoid being seen by the neighbors. I circled the house slowly until I heard noises coming from an open window on the left side of the cottage. Carefully approaching the partially open window, which was at shoulder height, I peered inside. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust to the dim light in the room, but soon I could clearly discern the figures of a woman and a man on a bed. They were both unclothed and already engaged in intimate activities. As I scrutinized his face, I began to notice a striking resemblance to Sandy, my daughter. He had the same delicate nose as her, and, of course, the same hair and eye color. There were no longer any uncertainties in my mind at this point. Carl Clarkson was Sandy's biological father, having conceived her with my supposedly faithful wife. Throughout all those years, she had led me to believe that I was Sandy's dad, effectively making a fool out of me. I couldn't help but imagine my wife and her lover sharing secret laughter at my expense. To them, I must have been the biggest fool imaginable, unknowingly raising another man's child. I couldn't deny that it was possible they were even planning to have another child together right now. However, my love for my daughter remained unwavering. In my heart and mind, she was still my daughter, and no one would ever take her away from me. Witnessing my wife engaged in an intimate act with another man was a monumental shock. It's an experience I wouldn't wish upon any husband. It stirred up a mix of intense anger and profound sadness, even though it strangely stirred some inappropriate feelings as well. At the same time, I felt utterly lost, unsure of my next steps. Tears streamed down my face, and I couldn't help but feel sorry for myself, further fueling my anger towards both of them. In that moment, I deeply regretted not bringing a camera with me, as having concrete evidence of her infidelity would have been valuable. At this point, I was resolute in my decision to file for divorce. I knew I needed convincing evidence of her affair to present in court and make a case for custody of Sandy. Watching your beloved wife engaging in a clandestine affair is a devastating experience. I couldn't bear to continue observing them or hearing their words, so I quietly retreated to the truck. Update. Rachel returned home at her usual time after work that day. She immediately went upstairs to take a shower while I carried on preparing dinner for the family, as was my routine on her workdays. Conversation between us was limited, but our attention was focused on Sandy, who eagerly shared details about her day at school. The next morning, a Wednesday, Rachel had the day off. She was in her robe, having breakfast with Sandy and me at the table. Occasionally, I noticed her stealing glances at me when she thought I wasn't paying attention, wearing a peculiar expression that seemed to suggest she suspected I knew about her affair with her boss. There was even a hint of fear in her gaze. That evening, while Rachel was busy in the kitchen putting away dishes, I recounted a fictitious story about a coworker at the plant. This coworker had discovered his wife's affair the previous week and reacted by physically assaulting her. I mentioned that his friends from work were considering taking action against her lover. After listening quietly, Rachel looked at me with widened eyes and asked if I believed it was the right course of action. I explained to her that a woman had no business cheating on her husband, and it was only fair that both the wife and her lover faced consequences for the disrespect they showed toward the sanctity of the husband's marriage. Tuesday came around again, and once more, I took the afternoon off, borrowing Jim's truck. After having lunch in the truck around noon, I drove to the lakeside cottage where, as expected, Carl's black SUV was parked in the driveway. This time, I had my video camera with me, fully prepared to capture evidence of their infidelity. I needed that proof not only to bolster my case for custody of Sandy, but also to confront Carl's wife. Yes, my intention was to hurt him as much as I could. He would face consequences for the illicit thrill he derived from his affair with my wife. For a while, I seriously contemplated getting a DNA test done on Sandy and me to use it as evidence of her infidelity. However, I soon realized that even if I proved I wasn't Sandy's biological father, it could give my wife ammunition in court to take Sandy away from me. Instead, I chose to feign ignorance of this fact and hoped that the video of their affair would suffice. They were once again engaged in intimate activities on the bed, just as I had witnessed before. However, this time, I captured everything on video. While recording them, I overheard Carl mentioning to my wife that he was ensuring his wife wouldn't obtain her driver's permit, preventing her from following him. Rachel later informed him that I had been acting strangely for the past few days, expressing her concern that I might be suspecting the truth about their affair. It was clear that this revelation was making Carl quite nervous. When I felt I had gathered enough footage of my unfaithful wife and her lover, I returned home to prepare dinner, as I typically did on her workdays. Her work usually ended at 6, and she would arrive home 15 minutes later. Therefore, I deduced that on those days she was supposed to be working, she and Carl must have been involved in their affair from 2:30 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. While making dinner for my soon-to-be separated family that evening, I resolved to leverage the fear both of them seemed to harbor toward me. I am not prone to violence, but I surmised that the fabricated story I shared about the man at the plant who had physically confronted his cheating wife had thoroughly frightened her. This, along with my new assertive attitude towards our physical relationship, likely contributed to the image of me that she was now perceiving. I believed she was biding her time, awaiting an opportunity for something to occur that would free her from me. She may have been anticipating that I would be served with divorce papers, allowing her to permanently be with her lover. On the Wednesday of the same week that I had captured her on film, while we were having dinner, I brought up the topic of the foolish husband from her workplace once again. I informed her that he had finally taken revenge against the man who had been involved with his wife. I went on to explain that the lover was now in the hospital, emphasizing that he had received his just punishment. Adding to the fuel of her anxiety, I mentioned that the betrayed husband had initiated divorce proceedings and sought custody of their children. I could see the shock in Rachel's face as she continued eating, her hands trembling. When she returned home after her afternoon tryst the following day, she appeared nervous, and fear was evident in her eyes. During our dinner, I began to inquire about her work, asking questions about her boss's appearance, the number of children he had, and so on. I had never previously shown interest in these details, so my sudden curiosity unsettled her and boosted my own sense of satisfaction. I even mentioned the possibility of visiting her at her workplace one day, aiming to sow more doubt and amplify her fear. It was clear that she was visibly taken aback, but she remained silent, looking at me with a peculiar expression and slowly nodding. That weekend, I took Rachel and Sandy out for a meal, behaving like a loving family. However, even Sandy could sense that her mother had changed in the past couple of weeks. My daughter began seeking my attention, asking questions, and seeking hugs from me instead of her mother. During that evening at the restaurant, when Sandy went to the restroom, I took the opportunity to ask Rachel if something was bothering her and if she wanted to talk about it. "Do you know what the problem is, Roger? I don't understand what has come over you in the past few weeks, but you've stopped being intimate with me," Rachel said. She looked at me with deep concern on her face. It was evident that she felt a hint of remorse in her cheating heart, but it was also clear that she had no intention of confessing anything to me. Even if she had confessed and begged for forgiveness, I wouldn't have been able to forgive her. It was far too late for that now. What she had done to our marriage, to me, and yes, to Sandy as well, was unforgivable. "You know, Roger, I love you, but for the past few weeks I haven't seen any love in your eyes when you're with me. It's been more like hatred," she confessed. That's when I asked, "Tell me, Rachel, are you being unfaithful to me? If you are, our relationship is over and you'll never see our daughter again. I can guarantee that." I had finally confronted her, and the truth was out in the open. She stared at me in silence, too shocked to respond. As we locked eyes, tears welled up in her eyes. Suddenly, she grabbed her purse and rushed out of the restaurant. I settled the bill and waited for Sandy, who was in the restroom. When we got to the car, Rachel was standing there, her eyes red, but she had stopped crying. The following Monday, I spoke to my boss and requested 2 weeks off. Initially hesitant, he agreed when I explained the family crisis. That afternoon, I drove to Carl's house. Parked in front of his home, I sat in my car for several minutes, contemplating my next move. I wasn't entirely sure what I would do, but I felt it was time to meet Carl's wife and lay the truth on the table. I spotted her in the backyard near the pool. She appeared taller than Rachel, with light brown hair similar to my wife's. Summoning the courage, I got out of my car and entered the backyard after opening the gate. She was rearranging chairs around the pool. As I approached, I introduced myself. "I'm Roger Weldon, and my wife Rachel works for your husband at the pharmacy." She gave me a puzzled look for a moment, then a smile graced her lips as she extended her hand. "Yes, of course, I've heard of Rachel. I haven't met her, but my husband mentions her from time to time. I'm Claudine Clarkson." She greeted me with a smile as we shook hands, and her pleasant personality was evident. However, I quickly realized that she remained completely unaware of her husband's affair with my wife. While I understood that the news I was about to deliver would be utterly devastating, there was no way to avoid it. She needed to know the truth. Therefore, I felt it best to be direct from the outset, as I hadn't come for a casual visit. "Mrs. Clarkson, what I'm about to share with you will undoubtedly bring you immense pain, but it's something you must hear. I regret to inform you that your husband and my wife have been engaged in an affair, and this has been going on for many years." She remained silent, her mouth slightly ajar, intensely scrutinizing me for several long seconds. Then, I observed tears welling up in the corners of her eyes. Standing motionless before me, she suddenly covered her mouth in shock. Before I could proceed with my revelations, she finally inquired whether I had any proof to substantiate my claims. "Yes, I possess evidence of their affair. I have photographs of them together in your lake cottage, and I'm afraid there's much more. Their involvement has spanned over 6 years, and to compound matters, I strongly suspect that your husband is the biological father of my daughter." Suddenly, she burst into tears, and I had to assist her in getting inside the house. I guided her to sit on the couch, patiently waiting for a few minutes until her emotions began to settle. Positioned before her, I retrieved a picture of my daughter from my wallet and handed it to her. "This is Sandy, my daughter. Do you notice the striking resemblance to your husband? Look, she shares the same blonde hair, slim nose, and high cheekbones. In fact, she bears a strong resemblance to your own daughter." There was a photo of her daughter displayed on the fireplace mantel. I stood up, retrieved it, and placed both pictures side by side on the coffee table in front of her. "Observe the likeness, Mrs. Clarkson. They could easily be mistaken for twins. We don't even need to pursue DNA tests to establish their relationship. It's evident to anyone that they are sisters." Update. Claudine had stopped crying by now, clutching both pictures tightly in her hands, her gaze fixed on them. At last, she raised her tearful eyes to me and asked desperately, "What should we do?" I replied, "As for me, I'm divorcing my wife and I intend to seek custody of my daughter." Claudine nodded, saying, "Yes, that seems like the only fair solution. I've had suspicions for a while that Carl was cheating on me, especially since I'm the one handling the laundry. He'll pay for his actions." I suggested, "You should consult an attorney, Mrs. Clarkson. If you'd like, I can provide you with copies of the pictures I already have of them together. However, we should wait a couple of days before revealing that we're aware of their affair. I'll explain why." Afterward, I retrieved the tape from my car, and we watched a portion of it together. It depicted my wife involved intimately with her husband. Claudine shed more tears, and after a few minutes, she pleaded with me to stop the tape. Once she had calmed down a bit, I outlined my plan to her. Reluctantly, she agreed to wait a few days before informing her husband of her decision to leave him. On Tuesday, I consulted with my lawyer, who informed me that despite the incriminating pictures of my unfaithful wife, gaining custody of Sandy would be challenging, especially since I wasn't her biological father. He clarified that my wife could simply request a DNA test for Sandy, proving that I wasn't her biological parent. Additionally, he mentioned that if she raised this argument in court, I could countersue Carl for years of child support, but would still likely lose custody of Sandy in the process. I absolutely didn't want this situation to unfold, so I instructed him to halt everything for now. I needed to find a way to push her into leaving our home and abandoning Sandy in my care. This is when I began devising a plan to achieve just that. If I could convince her to go away with her lover, even if only for a brief period, she would jeopardize her chances of gaining custody of our daughter in case of a separation. After all, there hadn't been any DNA tests conducted yet to confirm that I wasn't Sandy's father, and a mother who left for a fling with another man wouldn't look favorable in the eyes of a judge. Upon Rachel's return from work, I noticed clear evidence of her infidelity. Her lips were smeared and glistening. As she realized that I now knew her secret, She burst into tears and implored my forgiveness. She attempted to communicate with me, repeatedly expressing her remorse. However, I remained silent, just staring at her. When it became apparent that I had no intention of talking to her, she eventually confessed that she intended to end her affair with Carl and quit her job. She even claimed her love for me alone and offered to make amends if I could forgive her. It was evident she was being dishonest. Having overheard her words about me while at the cottage with her lover, I knew she had no intention of leaving him. No, she was merely stalling for time. It was clear that she had decided to leave me for Carl, and the only thing holding her back from an immediate departure was Sandy and her fear of my reaction. To compel her to run away with her boss, I needed to stoke that fear. She had to feel threatened, both for her own safety and that of her lover. Consequently, I calmly informed her that I would never forgive her for betraying me and that my retaliation against her and Carl would be excruciating. Of course, I didn't mention that I wasn't Sandy's biological father. Later that afternoon, I drove to Claudine's house. Following my suggestion, she had hired the same lawyer I had. She informed me that he had already prepared much of the paperwork for both divorces. Claudine also mentioned that her husband had been acting strangely in the past 24 hours. She spotted him loading boxes into his SUV when he thought she was in the yard. She suspected that he was secretly planning to leave her. I made her realize that this could be the best outcome for her, as she would automatically gain custody of her daughter if he did indeed leave. Abandoning his family would mean losing everything and portraying himself poorly in front of a judge if it came to that. Naturally, Rachel didn't go to work that Tuesday. She informed me that she had quit her job and had no intention of ever speaking to Carl again. I had little faith in her promise, as I knew she was being untruthful, and I had no intention of remaining married to her much longer. Later that day, I noticed her discreetly packing items from her walk-in closet, signaling her plan to leave me soon. However, I was determined not to let her take Sandy with her. To further intensify her desire to run away with her lover, I decided to continue instilling more fear in her already disturbed mind. In the afternoon, I explained to her that I intended to deal with Carl the following week. When she inquired about my intentions regarding our marriage, I simply informed her that after I had addressed her lover, I would decide what to do with her. I could see the fear in her eyes as she gazed at me silently for an extended period. I'm not naturally a violent person, and prior to the past 2 weeks, I had always treated her with gentleness, both in bed and in our daily interactions. However, after discovering that she had broken her marriage vows over 6 years ago and was still doing so, the love I once had for her had completely vanished, and I transformed into a different person. Not a violent man, but a sorrowful and resentful one. The next day, I drove Sandy to school and had a conversation with the school's administrator. I informed her that my wife was planning to run away with another man, and there was a risk she might attempt to abduct my daughter. I stressed that under no circumstances should they allow my wife or anyone else to take my daughter from the school premises. I explained that I would personally drop her off at school every day and pick her up from inside the school in the afternoon. When I returned home after dropping Sandy off at school, I sensed that my wife was on the verge of leaving me. Later that afternoon, I visited Claudine's house. I was aware that while I was away, my wife would likely use the phone to communicate with Carl. However, I anticipated this and hoped they would proceed with their plan to run away together. I wanted my wife out of my life and preferred Carl to be as far away from me as possible. Serving divorce papers to my unfaithful wife was no longer an option because there was a risk she would take Sandy away from me in the process. Instead, I aimed to compel her to run away with Carl, leaving her daughter behind, even if only for a few days. My intention was to relocate to a distant part of the country with my daughter if that occurred. When I arrived at Claudine's house, she was in tears. She informed me that Carl had taken most of his belongings from their home and left without revealing his destination. I realized that he had been waiting for me to leave my house so he could rendezvous with Rachel. However, I wanted to ensure they didn't take Sandy with them, so I promptly drove to Sandy's school. Upon my arrival, I spotted Carl's car in front of the school. He was with my wife, and they both saw me parking my car in front of the school. Upon seeing me, they hastily drove away. My daughter remained inside the school, and I took her home with me. Later, I had a conversation with Sandy, explaining that her mother would be away for a while due to a visit to a sick relative. The following day, I replaced all the locks on the doors and then met with my lawyer to inform him that Rachel had abandoned her family and eloped with her lover. Subsequently, I visited a real estate agent to list my house for sale, expressing my desire for a quick sale. Since the property was solely in my name, I anticipated no issues with the paperwork. That evening, I contacted Claudine, who was in tears. She revealed that her husband had left a note on her bed, confessing his love for someone else and his intention to leave her. He also mentioned that he had consulted his lawyer the previous week, transferring the house and cottage into her name alone and leaving a modest sum of money in her bank account. I felt a sense of responsibility for her predicament and explained that my daughter, Sandy, missed her mother's presence in the house. Since I was planning to order a large pizza and salad, I invited Claudine and Kathy to join us for dinner. Less than 15 minutes later, they arrived at my house. Inviting them to dine with us turned out to be a wise decision. Sandy and Kathy got along exceptionally well, alleviating the void left by her mother's absence. As for me, Claudine's company was both enlightening and comforting, making for a pleasant evening for all of us. Subsequently, things progressed quickly, and Claudine and I developed a strong friendship. She sold her cottage and house, moving in with me just a couple of weeks later. We formed a loving family, and to outsiders, we appeared as a married couple with 2 lovely daughters. Recognizing the need to prevent our estranged spouses from locating us, I proposed relocating once my house found a buyer. Within a month of Rachel leaving me, we were living in Texas with Claudine and the 2 girls. Over the years, I constructed a comfortable home in a mid-sized town and discovered success as a house contractor, even employing 5 men. It has now been 5 years since Claudine and I moved to Texas. Last year, we welcomed a baby boy into our family, and everyone here believes we are a happily married couple with Sandy and Kathy as our 2 daughters. Regarding Rachel and Carl, we've never received any communication from them during these years, and we both hope we never will. Perhaps by now, they've realized that cheaters ultimately face consequences. After all, they lost all contact with their respective daughters due to their affair. Life is truly wonderful for us now.